Hey, I'm Taylor Dorsett, and this is the Professional Technical Interviewee. Technical interviews are hard, and every company does them differently. On this show, I interview engineering leaders to see what they look for in technical candidates, and then they perform a real technical interview with me. I hope you enjoy.
Great. Well, we are back in the more technical portion here. So, Zach, I know you thought about different ideas, and this is something that you do a little bit currently at Amount, if I remember correctly, and it's more of a code reading exercise.
Yeah, that's right. So as I mentioned, I've done code reading, code writing, architecture. I've actually been on every part of that panel interview. And what I've noticed is our code reading exercises are a little bit different from what you typically see. And because they're a little different, I figured it would be, and they don't take too long either. They're 30 minutes usually. They'd be a fun little problem to go through. So you can see an example of how we evaluate someone for their ability to read code.
Yeah.
One of the ways, anyways, one of the questions.
Great.
And so I've actually sent you a link in the Zoom chat. So if you could open that up for me, that'd be really helpful. Now, this would be a different link if you didn't know Ruby. Again, we're a language agnostic shop, and depending on what language you are, we would identify the right repo to look at. But what we're going to do in this code reading exercise is I'm going to ask you some questions about this code base, and you're going to demonstrate for me how you would find the answers so that you can give me those answers. This is Sidekick. You mentioned earlier that you actually have some familiarity with Sidekick in terms of what it is, but not necessarily how it works or how it's built or any of that, which is really the kind of the perfect level of knowledge. If you were familiar, we would say, oh, well, let's find another repo and start over. But since you haven't seen it, I'm going to let it fly. And our goal here is like I said, I'm just going to ask you some questions, and I want you to demonstrate how you would go about finding those answers. And the first question is really simple. This is essentially like the baseline, like, you know, if you had like a polygraph tester, like, are you sitting in a chair kind of question, is show me how you would tell me, and then tell me what it is Sidekick does, what it is.
Well, they have a nice little description here. The repo description. It's a simple, effective background processing for Ruby. So I'm assuming it's a Ruby gem that can handle background processes and can run different types of jobs.
Sure. Can you show me a little bit more about like how you would get set up with it? Like if you wanted to use a package, what would you do?
Yeah, I'm assuming in this README, we've probably got an installation and get started. If we weren't specifically in this repo, I'm sure their website also probably has documentation that would be helpful. Looks like they have a wiki. Oh, and a YouTube playlist. Wow. Maybe this is why we use Sidekick. So for context, at Home Shift, we do use Sidekick. I have a login. I've never logged into it. So that's about the end of my knowledge. But maybe this is why we use it, because it seems like this is pretty decent documentation. So if I was going to use this, I would probably look at their wiki.
Cool.
This is what I would expect at a get up and running page.
Now, do you want me to actually explain what I'm looking for as part of the interview process inline, or would you like us to wait till the end and then have me explain what I was looking for? Because this is, you know, like a fun interview. Like this isn't like you're actually applying for the job. So I'm allowed to just tell you, like, what are we looking for here?
Yeah. Let's do that. You just do it live. I won't take.
Okay, I think that's more fun. So yeah, so that the first question is really basic because it is, hey, does this person know to look for documentation? And you would be shocked how many people start digging straight into the code immediately. The fact that you just scroll down is actually, I'd say only about 70% of people do that. And that you notice that there's a wiki page that you opened up in another tab is essentially you've completed that successfully. Because again, people that even see the documentation will say, oh, I'll just do bundle add Sidekick. And then like stop there because they just want to move on and they get nervous. So just noting, like I said, I asked you, right? What would you do to get started with this project? What would you do to get set up, I think is the exact words I said. But that's it. That is the direct specific answer to my specific language. You've passed the most basic question there.
It is funny because this wiki page is what I would actually expect. Like, I would normally expect to see this as part of that initial README. So it is interesting that it's in this different file, but it's
sure.
I think it makes sense.
Now let's go to the next question, which is, can you show me in the source code where a job gets queued? So If like we would typically spend a little bit more time actually reading through get started.
Mhm.
The getting started, which shows you here's a job, here's how you do it. And but yeah, basically I want to see, how do you queue a job? How would you set it
Yeah,
up so that you have a job that is queuable?
interesting.
And then go to the code in it. So even if you start with documentation, which it looks like that's where we are right now, I want to see the
Yes.
exact file line.
Let's see. So for glancing through this, since it's in Ruby, it's pretty easy to add a gem, right? And then looks like we can run this command. It'll generate a job file. Okay. Which would have a perform action within it. Then we could define form method, a specific, so different jobs. So this would be the actual job, right? I believe.
Okay.
And then we wanted to we can specify if we want to do it synchronously at a certain time, within a certain time, but we're looking for when it actually gets queued. Is that correct?
The actual queuing of the job to be performed.
Yeah, so that
Because
might
remember, this is
be,
asynchronous, so jobs are run in a separate service that would have to be running. And so
yeah. So there's two different ways I would look for this. It's probably gonna be in this documentation, right? So like if I continue to look through this, we might find that here. If I was if we didn't have good documentation, I would probably do some type of, what is it, just T, and look for like Q, which might bring us to this line, right? Or at least a web view, which somebody might be able to track back to a model. If I'm doing it efficiently, I'm probably going to read through the documentation to try to find that. Do you have an approach you prefer, or you think that makes more sense?
So we're still in interview mode. I'm not giving you answers right now.
I'm
So
asking
I'm
in
gonna
interview mode.
yes, and I'm gonna say, unfortunately, I don't want to like lead you down any particular path. I'm trying to evaluate your strategies for determining it right now. So if you believe that documentation is the best practice, definitely keep doing that. If you believe that navigating through the code base is the best practice, do that. If you want some sort of hybrid, all I care is I want you to be able to show me where the queuing happens in code.
Cool. Well, they have good documentation, so then I'll stick in that. It looks like they have quite a bit of basically they have a section called queues, which I'm assuming that might point us in the right direction. So it lets us, Sidekick requires us to define the queues to process when it starts. List the queue names out in this config file. You can set priorities. Okay, different types of jobs are put in different queues, but that didn't work well. So now we have a few prioritized queues. Okay, so it looks like our queues are either going to be given one of these priorities, and then those may all sit in the same queue. All jobs default to prioritizing. So this is an app, load defaults. Space options. Okay, so this is just disabling Ruby queuing. It does not necessarily
Yeah.
point to where we would set up queues here.
Now, just to clarify, because I may have thrown you off with my language, I'm not asking for the queues themselves. I'm asking how a job gets queued. So where, when someone schedules a job, what is that scheduling code? When someone says, I
okay.
want this to be run, right? You
Well, we
define
did
a
have this.
perform.
Yes.
Yeah.
We had this perform action. Jobs can be added to the queue from anywhere. Well, that's good to know. We can add a job to the queue by doing this.
Okay.
So we've added that to the queue. Does not necessarily seem that's exactly where it runs, but args.
Yeah, I'm not
Example
asking where the perform method gets called. I'm asking exactly what you just said. So we're one step closer, I think, potentially.
Okay, Sidekick will run the job for us. Q as that's, oh, this would, so it would sit within jobs. So it might just be in jobs is where I would, jobs is
Okay.
kind of a folder. I thought it might, this is kind of, looks like example code.
Yeah,
Not,
that's okay. Yeah, my app is sample code. I can tell you that.
okay.
It just demonstrates the basic functionality. I think this is using active job as the mechanism. So it's like the tie-in to Rails.
Yeah. Application controller, work controller. So let's see if it might be in here. I think this is going to count our jobs. It's going to set up an email job. Well, this was a, I know it talked about bulk jobs. Like this, I think, is
Yeah.
adding jobs.
That's what I'm
yeah,
asking. Yeah, so this is adding jobs to a queue. That's an
yes,
example of adding multiple jobs at once to a queue.
got it. Okay, I didn't see if there was. Oh, maybe this. No, that's actual posts. I was just looking if there was a way to singularly add one job. Documentation on that, but this is the bulk way to do that. Okay. So is that what you're looking for, or is there something more specific?
I want to see the actual code that's doing it. So we're closer because this is like, so like if you could go into push bulk as an example,
Let's see if this nice.
push bulk.
Okay, so it's gonna, don't want to, it's basically making sure it takes it in as an array. Making sure it's getting the right arguments in the array. Past that. Okay, normalizing arguments, mapping through this. That is array result. Copy
Yeah.
key, Redis pool.
Sidekick has a lot of cool middleware functionality that we actually use that amount for all sorts of fun stuff for like metrics and all that.
Yeah, I thought we would have, if this was the bulk method, at some point in here we would
Yep.
have a call that is basically swimming within this map or pushing these jobs into something that is
You said the magic word. What are we doing with these jobs?
pushing these jobs.
Push, yes.
So if we're,
You're so close.
oh, okay, so we're pushing them all to Redis.
That's how they get queued, is they get into Redis.
Okay.
Which
And
is, that's an
then,
important thing that I am always seeing how quickly they notice. Sometimes for juniors, I'll mention Redis and instead I'll ask like, how does the job get into Redis? For a
yeah,
more senior engineer, I'll just say, how do you queue it? What's the queuing mechanism? How does the asynchronous processor know to get a job, that a job exists to even run it? Which
yeah,
ends up being Redis. But we're still not at the part where the content is being written to Redis, which is the goal. We're very close.
yeah, returns less than a minute or something. So this is where we're doing this raw push.
Yep.
Pushing the payloads unless the payload is empty, then the payloads collect. So then let's see. This is the Redis pool. Connection, should begin. Pipeline. We've got an atomic push with the pipeline and the payload. So I think I'm not exactly sure what the pipeline is, but maybe that's where we're pushing.
That is a mechanism in the Redis gem. You don't need to know about it,
Okay.
honestly. But
Got it.
this is far enough. Raw push is how stuff gets queued. Now,
Got it.
because you went through that push bulk, you still haven't technically found how an individual job gets scheduled. So I want to ask, can you work backwards from raw push to find the method that sends a single job?
Yeah, I'd probably just search for, I mean, I'm assuming it's probably at the
Yeah.
top of this file, but I
Well,
would
just keep
search
doing it.
for
Just, yeah.
what else, where else we might have raw push or where else we might have push.
Yep.
This looks like it might be a single payload. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I was searching payloads instead of payload.
Mhm.
which is why it might not have showed up, but it needs to be in brackets with this
It's yeah.
syntax. Yep. Yeah. Okay,
That's
there we go.
because Matt Perham didn't think of splats or array casting. Or
Oh,
didn't
there's such
care.
good documentation. Okay, so
I
some of
know,
the
I
stuff that
love
I
it.
was trying to parse through, it literally put in plain
Yeah.
English up here for me. Interesting. Okay,
Uh-huh.
so push, and it gives you basically the exact line. Interesting.
Yep. So how do we get to push though? Remember, we're starting from like, I have my Rails app and I want to trigger a job to run asynchronously. We have to get to push from somewhere. So we haven't continued going up. You're right that push is the correct mechanism. We are in the Sidekick client right now.
Yeah.
This
And
is
then
what I
you would
usually
look
end up
at
calling code archaeology sometimes because you're like digging into a place and you're trying to like reconstruct what's
yeah.
going on to get to the results.
Main method just to push a job to Redis. Sorry, can you repeat your question? How do we get to push?
How do we get to push? Like, I want to
So
schedule
something
one
would
job to
call
run.
this.
This is actually, I'm going to give you a hint because it's fun. You have seen this line of code in both documentation and code multiple times now. At least it's been open on your screen.
So assuming we would, well, let's see. It's a little further back. When I was on the um, before here on that getting started documentation or an active job. So I thought this was one of these we could push from here. Curious. I thought we could use this code from anywhere at some point.
So this is active job based. So these are not Sidekick
Oh,
jobs. I'm gonna be honest. This is a bit of a red herring. This documentation did not exist last time I did this interview, which since this was December 25th, kind of, or at least I had never run into active job implementation. If you look at the getting started documentation, you'll see another reference
got it.
because I want to.
That's the perform or asynchronous.
Yeah, let's walk through step one, add sidekick to your gem file.
Yeah.
Step two, add a job and app sidekick to process the job asynchronously. So this generates the job, generates the job file as well as the tester spec. So there's a hard job, include sidekick job, def perform, name and count, do something.
Simple thing.
You can do name spacing. So there's like your little 2A, and then 3, create a job to be processed asynchronously. Hard job to perform async, Bob. 5. Note that perform is an instance method, whereas perform async is called on the class. You can also create a job to be processed in the future. Perform in and perform at.
So is hard job, it's the class, are we gonna end up pushing that? Calling push on that?
So hard job, if you recall, if you scroll back up to the definition of hard job, what do we see here? It's pretty, there's almost
Class.
nothing. It has a
Yeah.
mix in for sidekick jobs.
Uh-huh.
That's it. And there's a method that you call on it. What method?
The perform method.
Oh, no, I mean, like if you go a little bit further down and we look at bullet point 3,
If basically the perform at, right?
perform async, perform in, and perform at. What are these
Yeah.
all doing? They're
Basically,
queuing a job to be worked.
got it. Just in different, in
Formats.
slightly different contexts, yeah. Formats.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay.
So
Is that us using that
mm-hmm.
push method though?
Mm-hmm. If you, yeah, like let's actually go to the perform async method. And this is again, now we're doing something I would not have been quite as pushy in like a real interview. I would have just said, let's move on at this point.
Yeah.
But I want to show you. So if we go to, yeah, if you want to search for perform async.
Is there a good way to, I use this a lot because it'll get a file name, but that would be within.
If you want to, sorry, I should have clarified this earlier, and it's something that I had started recently. And which is why I'm not consistent about it yet. Is if you wanted to download or interact with this code in a different way, you could. if you're not as familiar with just navigating GitHub. I'll tell you now, you can, at the top left where it says search or jump to, you can search through code in that block.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so you could do a search
Yep.
for perform async in there. But again, if you'd rather use VS Code or RubyMine or Sublime or whatever you've got, you can do that. And in fact, it's recommended that you use whatever you've got the most expertise with, because again, at Amount, we don't constrain what tooling the developer uses. We have devs that use Emacs or Vim. We have developers that use VS Studio. I mean, like literally the whole gamut. So
Interesting.
it's always again about like the person demonstrating their competencies or their ability to flexibly learn. So
Do we have a? Yeah, we should
yeah.
have performed.
Lib
defined.
sidekick worker, which is also sidekick job. I think it's aliased because again, the documentation was updated like literally at the end of last year to change
Got
this.
it.
But yeah, there'll be it would be, I think it's in class methods.
Options, retry, the attributes. Okay.
And it calls. Oh, there's a sync option that they built into it. That used to not exist. I had to write that myself.
Oh, okay.
And
What
climb
is
push is
this?
going to go to push.
Got it.
Yeah.
What is this
So,
class? You know what that is?
um,
I guess we could. It probably doesn't. Is it defined in this file?
yeah, the setter initialize.
Okay. So you said client push goes to push.
It does. Yeah.
Got it. And
So
then this
again,
is where we pass in the arguments and the.
yep.
Got
So
it.
this is what just happened essentially was a test of your ability to basically use the documentation to track to method calls and then go from that method call down to essentially the endpoint where you basically cannot follow what's happening anymore, which would be the Redis raw push. So you could go to
Mhm.
atomic push and then you'll see like some Redis write, and then you're like, here's the exact code.
Yeah.
Obviously I think this could have gone a little bit better since you missed perform async as the method that is
Mhm.
explicitly defined in getting started as the method that like does the scheduling for queuing.
Yeah.
Admittedly, I'm a little rusty. I probably could have phrased that a bit better, so I would have taken that into account. But strategically, I think you did okay where you were looking at the documentation, you were trying to correlate that back to the code. Another thing I always look for is whether they have some instincts for where code might be expected to live. So when you did a
Mhm.
search in the file system for queue, you recognize that that was not right. So that I think was pretty well executed. The fact that you were spending most of the time in the active job documentation, again, that's a little bit my fault, a little bit your fault, because that didn't exist last time. We don't do that. You wouldn't have ended up there, I think, if you had followed the getting started documentation a little bit more
Mhm.
closely, but I know time is always a constraint there, so I think that's all right. But definitely what the usual path I see is people see perform async, they notice that that method has to be defined as part of that include sidekick job or include sidekick worker. So they go straight to this worker. Or when people tend to do really badly, they just start clicking around and stuff that sounds right without really doing any thinking of the problem at all. So again, I
Mhm.
think you've done reasonably well so far. Um, the next question is kind of the same thing from but sort of the opposite direction.
Mhm.
So now we've got our code, we've triggered our thing into Redis, but somewhere that perform actually has to be happening. Can you show me where and how that work gets that happens, and then can you actually explain to me in plain English what's going on?
So where it. So I think we got a perform
So
method
yeah,
earlier.
so put more broadly, we have a worker defined with an instance level perform method. Can
Mhm.
you show me how that perform method gets called? And then explain to me like how that's happening, like as like the operation of the shell command, I guess.
Yeah.
Or the
I think we had a perform method. Or,
That's right. Mm-hmm.
yes. And this perform.
Yep.
You're talking about like I'm assuming
So,
this would
so
be here, right? Like we
yeah,
would.
so to explain the problem again, like, so we do like hard job dot perform async Bob
Mhm.
and 5. And so Bob and 5 end up, we know now, in Redis,
Yeah.
right? So we know that hard job and Bob and 5 all end up in Redis, and then something pops that off of Redis and runs the perform method, passing in Bob and 5. What
Got it.
is that something? Where is the code that it lives? And then can you explain to me the actual like running operations that result in perform happening in plain English? Like what is, again, I'm trying to be a little bit careful with my language
Yeah.
here to
Yeah.
not give away too much, but it'll make more
Yeah.
sense once we get to, again, starting with the concept of, we know something's in Redis that has to be taken out. And eventually that's going to result in perform happening, the perform method getting called. Where is that?
Yeah. Okay. I understand the question now. So I would look back to it because that's not a thing that I think I have a guess like guessing at. Okay, well maybe queues just lives in queuing. I don't really have a guess on what that might look like, other than it might maybe call some method like this, or like pop, right? But searching a whole code base for where pop might live, it's not necessarily what I would
Yeah, that
do.
might get you some false
Yes.
positives.
So if I'm going back to the documentation, these are some best practices. It doesn't look like that might be there, but maybe in using Redis, might talk about it's actually pulling something off of Redis. It may not. It's in the cloud, like that. Multiple instances. No, it does not seem like that's what I'm looking for. Um, interesting. How might I find that?
What I can say is, if it helps, take a moment to think about the architecture, right? Like what do we
Mhm.
typically, right? Like this pattern of parallelism where you have one thing running and then pushing stuff to another thing that's continuously processing, right? That's like a
Mhm.
particular pattern that I know you're familiar with, right?
Mhm.
And we've in fact seen the name both in code and reference in the documentation, right? Sidekick client.
Yeah.
So what's the other side of a client?
Uh, client and the user, the client and the server.
So let's think through. So we have like the idea of like maybe a user, maybe a server, maybe something else. How would you verify by looking through the documentation and slash or the code to find which one is going to be correct or more accurate? Or what sort of strategies might you use to figure out, like you said, like, you could technically search for pop, it just would be really hard to like find the correct instance of pop. But we also know from having looked through the code, that there is some sort of Redis abstraction in that code that like handles some
Mhm.
sorts of specific behaviors. So
Yeah, I guess my instinct is to look back at this type of worker file to see like, okay, if we have a push method, then we might have some other type of method within this worker file to basically pull things back out, right?
sure,
Or to actually start something in Redis. And then within this, I could probably look for where we're making those Redis calls, since we know we're going to be interacting with that.
sounds
Um,
good.
so if this is, we got to perform, we got to set, initialize, I think that's just making our, this is for the setter class. We've got perform bulk, is it upper methods, sidekick options.
There's that perform async, by the way. It's inside of class
Yeah.
methods. That's like an active record concern thing. Actually, they don't use active record concern. They have the standard pattern of like included do self dot class dot extend class methods. But yeah, that because I just wanted to note that because you'd shown
Yeah.
perform async earlier, but this is how you get to the setter instance of perform async.
Got it.
And so you can see that class is an instance, is the job class. See, because
Mhm.
it's just self. So when you include sidekick worker, that class is the thing being sent over.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so I'm not necessarily seeing this, but maybe I want to finish. Yeah, I don't really think there's anything else here, but client push might lead me to that.
Yeah,
Again,
client
I'm just
class
thinking,
can be configured or defaults to sidekick client. So that'd be in what, lib sidekick client.
yeah. let's see. Uh,
I think there were like two eyes there. It's like a really touchy. Honestly, like GitHub file search is like meh.
yeah, it's interesting. I would typically pull this down just because I'm a little bit more familiar with or it's a little bit, I think, more straightforward to search through the VS Code. Actually,
Yeah.
someone just showed me that yesterday, that file search. I was like, oh, I wish I would have known this a long time ago.
Yeah, if you like, there's no time limit on deciding you want to use a different tool. Feel free to clone it and poke at it with your preferred tool. I think getting a different perspective sometimes is actually a good way to like break yourself out of like a stuck part, right? Because you just,
Yeah.
forces you to take a step back. Like one trick I use for refactoring very regularly is instead of trying to adjust or change the code, I'll actually open up the old code in one window and start rewriting the code completely in another window as is,
Oh,
and
interesting.
make the changes as necessary when I see that something. So I really am starting with a new design entirely, and I'm just using the original code as reference, and it ends up being the same depending on how much needs to be refactored, but it does make it a lot easier to get perspective on it. It's a trick that I learned actually from writing fiction. So
Interesting.
git clone it, open it up in your tool, and you'll probably, I think, feel a little bit better about what you're doing right now.
Okay, I was just looking at this client file,
Yeah.
which again had a lot of like, let me pull this file up. Client maybe.
Yeah. Just to reiterate the question, because it's been a while since we mentioned it, I want to see how does the perform method get called and what is the actual running operations that result in it, and can you explain those to me? Right, we know our goal is like we have some hypothetical sidekick job or sidekick worker and it calls a perform method, and that's what we want. That we know that we have to get to it from somewhere, and we know that it currently, like, there's some payload in Redis that has that info.
Right. But you don't want to, I mean, I
But
was
I
I was at the
remember,
perform or perform at method. Like that's not what we're looking for. We're
no, we're
looking
looking at the
for
other side. We're looking at
right.
the actual running now instead of the getting it into a queue. Because once you get it into a queue, the process essentially ends. There's nothing more there, the rest of the code gets to continue on because there's nothing more happening. You've reached the leaf of the end of the stack of calls that occur when you
Yeah.
call .perform async. And so now we're essentially starting with a new stack in another process because it's
Yeah.
async, so we know that there's some other process running. That's that. Yeah, I would explain it, but my question is for you to explain it.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think so. I think the part where I'm stuck is maybe misunderstanding. So I keep expecting to see if we've got a push, right? Then shouldn't we have some type of pop or pull or basically actual do method that within this, or some other file. So we do have the client, which we were talking about earlier. That, I mean, the job is the other thing I can think of, that maybe within this job we're actually doing something, right? That's
Job is
making a
just an alias for
worker,
worker. Yeah.
and
And
worker,
we
I
already
think
looked at the
is
worker.
where
The worker
perform
is the
is,
individual
right?
workers. It's where
Yeah.
it's when we include this mix in, then we define a perform method. Here's our
Yeah.
Redis connection itself, which is great, but it might be too deep in the stack to necessarily walk
Oh,
back to.
maybe a fetch. If I
Hmm.
kept talking about pop,
Yeah.
fetching a command is another way to say that.
Yeah.
Fetching a job. Okay. Um, oh, interesting.
2015. Some of these commits are pretty old.
Yeah. You gotta love it.
Sometimes they don't need a change.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we've got a queue. We've made that queue. We've ordered this queue. Retrieve. Oh, there we go. Okay. Well, that's good. Um, first size. We're gonna sleep. Okay. Queue and the job. This looks like our actual Redis connection that we're
Yep.
calling, right?
Yep.
And
BR
then
pop is basically grabs off of a stack and removes it from the stack. Like a
yes.
set of things at once.
And then we're creating a new unit of work based
Mm-hmm.
off of that queue, the job and the config if queue.
Yep.
So
So
unit
that's
of
what,
work is
yeah,
probably what we're
it's a
looking for
struct
here.
that's defined at the top of the file. So I can tell you it's just a struct. So that's the return value of the,
Oh, got it.
yeah,
Okay.
the return value of retrieve work method, which is great. We know that we definitely have to retrieve work before we run perform on it. So we're getting closer.
Yes. So then it's a struct. Um, acknowledge queue name or requeue. I guess again. So this is where I'm confused. Shouldn't there also be a do work? Like, um,
Mm,
that's what I think I'm misunderstanding. If we've retrieved it,
That's
we've
certainly one way to, that's a much more object oriented way to do it, certainly. Um, but
we've retrieved the work.
so we know retrieve work is where we get it out of Redis. But it looks like that just returns an object, which means this is the leaf of some stack. Or again, it's the leaf of some tree. It's the top of one stack of some calls.
Yeah. So then where am I? This is the so I've gotten at this job. I'm back in Ruby before I was in full stack JavaScript. And what I did like about full
Mm.
stack JavaScript is at the top of this, you're probably gonna have every component
Well,
that's touching this.
the
And Rails sometimes is less apparent to me on where we're.
well, first off, yeah, this is not Rails at all, which is cool. Rails makes everything so much harder. There's Rails support in Sidekick, but we're not in it. But the thing with the requires at the top, I think you'd run into the same problem in JavaScript because I think yeah, and this is me giving advice out of the
Mhm.
interview process a little bit. You've inverted the relationship. Because retrieve work we know is the last thing that's called because it just returns some value and we know that this is where stuff starts. Something has to call retrieve work. You're
Mm,
thinking of retrieve work giving you the stuff to do something, but actually something is calling retrieve work and then doing the work,
that makes
right?
sense.
You're searching for again like an object oriented pattern, but the pattern inside of here is different. And
Yeah.
so what I would be looking for in an interview process here, and um, no offense, but this is where you're kind of like you've definitely hit a wall
Mhm.
is the navigation piece, understanding the pattern of like breaking down the problem in the sense of like method calls, understanding that this is fundamentally a method call stack problem. I'm asking
Yeah.
you, what is the call stack that ends to your thing? And I've given you two clues that let you approach it
Mhm.
from either end. The first was the Redis clue, which has got you to unit of work eventually, which means you're at the bottom of the Redis stack, and then you can work your way up and identify what's going on. The other
Mhm.
is, I said, it's the perform method. If you look for calls to a thing, dot send perform or dot perform, if
Yeah.
you just grep through the code base, you find it pretty much immediately, and you can go from there first down to see that it's coming, the object is coming from Redis, and then up to see where it's running from. So those
Mm.
are like your expected ingress points that like, especially like a senior developer. Again, this is a question that I can ask of both juniors and seniors, and how much guidance I give and what my expectations are of the outcome come a lot from what role they're applying for. So
Yeah.
it's the one of the other advantages of that strategy, by the way, is that sometimes people apply for junior but they're actually really good and we can bump them up to mid, and vice versa. Sometimes they come in saying like, I'm hot shit, I'm really good, and they do really really poorly on this stuff, and we're like, well, we can lowball you, and very rarely do they take the lowball. Usually they're
Mhm.
insulted by it, but every once in a while they're like, okay, I can come in as a junior, I'll work my way up to mid, and those people fit better into those roles and those expectations once you have the clear expectations on them. Whereas if you do different stuff for each person, like if someone is applying for junior but is actually very good, you give them the junior test, they ace it, you're like, cool, you're a good junior. You're underbanding them. They end up surpassing expectations for everyone, but they're not getting paid enough. They get upset because they're not being,
Yeah.
essentially compensated fairly, and then they bail after a year. So it's really useful to use the same questions.
Yeah, I like it.
So
I think this is actually a thing I am not great at, is kind of parsing through code, which is why I was interested to do this
yeah,
particular thing, especially
We're-
within Ruby. It's something that I feel like I'm pretty weak at. So this is an interesting exercise.
yeah, and I'll note, off to the side, I have like blocks of like what I expect out of junior, mid, and senior in terms of like doesn't understand concurrency but is able to find the server, figures out client versus server as the architecture but has trouble with like the Redis pieces, or can
Mhm.
explain the mix-ins, like again their familiarity with navigating code bases by using different tools such as grep or find in files, versus having to click through stuff. Like again, your utilization of GitHub is something I'm looking at as well, where you're like, oh, I know how to click through and like see the automated population. That's actually a tool that some people don't even know. One of the metrics we find for people in the company in terms of how they perform after is actually their tool usage.
Mm.
Devs that don't know how to search for strings do worse. Devs that don't know how to use the mouse and keyboard shortcuts, one or the other, or both, do worse.
Mm. Interesting.
Familiarity and comfort with your tools can be learned. And again, for a junior, we expect there to be some kludginess or some confusion, right? If you don't know that you can press T to search the tree, that's going to hurt your ability to use it. But if you know that there is a tree, like you should, like I would expect any developer to know that there's a file tree and be able to like click through files one way or
Mhm.
another. But the main thing is again, like breaking it down into these different problems. So yeah, like I think at this point you probably could finish it. I know we've spent 40 minutes. I don't know how long exactly, but from this point, you could find that the actual class's processor and calls unit of work, it does retrieve work from that fetcher. And then the reason it's in a separate fetcher class is you can override the fetcher class to everything in
Mm.
Sidekick is crazy configurable. It's really cool. Point is, it grabs your stuff and then it creates an instance of your class, deserializes the payload, and then calls perform on it. So you were really close. But yeah, I would be like, he's all right. I'm not super excited about him, but like he understands the basic concepts and he really seems comfortable reading Ruby code. That
Mhm.
I think if I'd pressured him less on time, he might have done better because he did a really good job on digging through documentation. He just jumped over some of the key features. Where I'm worried is again that idea of breaking down the problem into call stack problems, understanding that what
Mhm.
I'm asking for is I call this thing, how to, where's the leaf or where's
Yeah,
the,
yeah, yeah.
and then, okay, describe for me the start of the thing, right? Because I wanted you to describe the processor running in a loop, popping entries off, doing the serialization, calling perform on it. That's what I was looking for broadly in this exercise, and the clarity, specificity, and thoroughness of your answer and how quickly you get to those answers is how I would evaluate in terms of senior, junior, or mid, not necessarily pass fail.
Yeah. Cool. Well, oh, it's interesting, and I feel like I learned something about Sidekick, which is nice. I'm glad I
Yeah,
actually have a somewhat better understanding of how it works. So that's cool.
yeah.
Uh, great. Well, anything else you want to add, or anything you want to? I know you mentioned you're hiring freeze right now, but I'm assuming roles will open up in the near future.
That's
Anything else you want
correct.
to
Yeah.
plug?
So we actually do have a couple backfills, I believe, and we'll be opening up hiring in the back half of August. So like keep an eye
Nice.
out on all of the typical places, Amount and Avant, or Amount and then back when it was Avant. Like you mentioned earlier, has always been a huge part of the Ruby and Rails community. We used to host Ruby Hack Nights at our office.
Hmm.
Fingers crossed we could do that again one day hypothetically, but in the meantime, like we're always seeking, when we're hiring good, like like every level of talent, there's going to be a role for you that's probably going to fit. The trick is be open, be honest, be excited about growing yourself, and be excited about actual technical problems. And like I think that's the key to a good technical interview.
Great. Well, thanks so much.
Absolutely. I had a really fun time doing this, actually. I was so scared. It ended up being totally like chill.
Thank you for watching the technical interview portion of the Professional Technical Interviewee. If you want to tackle this interview question, you can find it at github.com/professional-technical-interviewee. New episodes are released on the first 4 Thursdays of each month. Find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Dorsett or on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. And remember, keep practicing.